When I think of Rambam, I think of a man of many hats. He was a philosopher, astronomer, physician, community leader, always on the run.
What makes Rambam so unique is you can't just name one of his accomplishments. He had so many. Rambam was a Talmudist, he was a posek, he was a philosopher, he was a medical practitioner. He knew everything.
Whether it was being a healer of the body or being a healer of the soul, saw those two as just different sides of the same coin.
Whether we're dealing with halakha ma'aseh or we're dealing with Jewish philosophy, everything is the basis, foundation for all of our Judaism the way we know it today.
He shaped Judaism.
The Rambam's works are the basis for all growth in Limud Torah.
Rambam was in search of truth. When he saw a challenge, he didn't want to put out the fire. That wasn't his approach. His approach was to take the challenges, dissect the challenges, and further his understanding of the world and of God, because that's who he was about.
Whether you're dealing with philosophy, you're dealing with Pirush Mishnah, you want to deal with his medical writings, which are unbelievable, and how he did it all while having such a terse schedule.
He wrote a book on logic, he wrote books on medicine. No one touched all of halakha. Everyone picked a topic and they went deep into it. Rambam covered all of halakha.
Mishneh Torah, there's nothing like it. I don't know why there's a million pirushim on it, because it's so clear. You can understand it the way it is. You don't need all these mefarshim on it. Sefer Mizvot is also something unbelievable. He codified all 613 Mizvot, put it out in a way that's easy to see where it comes from Torah Shebichtab, how we understand it, and how we could fulfill it in a simple manner. Nothing like it.
He wrote Pirush HaMishnah when he was in his 20s. It's unbelievable.
Rambam, in his introduction to Pirush HaMishnah, lists his mission statement to us with 4 main goals: to teach us the text and framework of the Mishnah, to give us a summary of the Talmud, to give us a quick taste of iyun, to understand the reasons of the Tanaim behind each Mishnah, and to give us bottom line halakha. Following in Rambam's footsteps, after his first work that he wrote, Pirush HaMishnah, we will be starting tomorrow, Mishnah study. He's studying a Mishnah with Pirush Rambam, 20 minutes a day, covering all of Torah Sheba'al Peh.
Rambam was clear, precise, systematic, logical. There's such precision in his work. Every word, there's a rhyme and a reason. Nothing is, I'm just going to write this or that.
Nearly every text that the Rambam authored was novel.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to what promises to be a special night. There's a great business metaphor about the difference between managing and leading. Imagine a group of people in the middle of a jungle. The workers are on the front lines, they're busy, they're chopping down a path in front of them. They think through the best methods, the most useful tools. They are detail-oriented. They are also vital if you want to move forward. Those are the managers. But while vital, they are not the most important. There's always that one person who finds the tallest tree in the forest, climbs to the very top, sees the bigger picture, and points to the right direction. That's a leader. In our thousands-year plus history as Jews, the basic functions are vital: the proper placement of a mezuzah, the timing of Shema in the morning. And yet every once in a while, we need to take a step back and ask ourselves the larger questions. What does it mean to live a good Jewish life? What role does Hashem play in the actions of this world? What is the meaning of existence? Maimonides lived 800 years ago and died before he was 70. And yet he remains the man at the top of the tallest tree, pointing us in the right direction. And yet, while many of us know that he was important, we also don't really know him as a man or what exactly his philosophy was. Rambam was a flesh and blood person, just like everyone in this room. He loved his father, and he loved his son, and he had a really deep, close relationship with his brother. He was a proud Sephardic Jew. He was also one of the greatest halachic and philosophical thinkers of all time. Knowing him is to be a better Jew and a better person. Tonight, we attempt to bring Maimonides back to life. We have 3 panelists of great distinction with us. Professor Moshe Halbertal is a premier Maimonides' biographer. His book, Maimonides' Life and Thought, will leave you with a deeper sense of who Maimonides was as a man, as a philosopher, and as one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of all time. We are actually giving away the book, if you haven't gotten it already. We have a few copies left. You're more than welcome to take one on the way out. We also have two pillars of our community with us, Rabbi Harold Sutton, and all the way from London, Rabbi Joey Dweck. We are also moderating this event with Dr. Mijal Bitton-Setton. Lastly, I just want to thank the Sephardic Community Alliance Committee who put this together. Few committees I worked on were as thorough, professional, and proactive. It was really an unbelievable effort by everybody involved. A lot of people worked on this, but I would like to highlight a few people. Amy Bailey, Yvette Hidary, Victor Dweck, and Maurice Levy. Excellent job, guys, really excellent. So, without further delay, I welcome you to engage in a special program to climb the tallest tree with Maimonides himself as your guide. Coincidentally, Harambam himself was born on Erev Pesach, which is actually just 2 weeks away, and it's a pretty good time to reintroduce ourselves to this giant. When you leave here tonight, it really would be beyond a success if somehow, some way, you felt that you were walking with the man himself and feeling a bit closer to that ultimate goal that he spent his life's work pursuing, living life as a complete Jew. With that, please give a round of applause for our panelists.
Hi, good evening, and thank you so much, Louis, for your really inspiring words. So friends, I'm really excited for the conversation that we're going to have tonight. Like Louis said, and like many of you know, so many of us grew up learning about Maimonides, reading Rambam's work, and really looking up to him as a role model for traditional yet modern intellectual Jews in the 21st century. But how often do we have the amazing opportunity to sit with world-class experts and really ask difficult and complicated questions about a figure that so many of us know and love so dearly? So it really is an absolute pleasure for me to have this conversation. We're going to hear today from Professor Moshe Halbertal, who wrote this book, in case you didn't notice, on Maimonides, and who's one of the most significant philosophers of Jewish thought today. And we also have erudite and inspiring rabbis, Rabbi Harold Sutton and Rabbi Joseph Dweck, who are going to guide us in a really exciting conversation. So now, before I direct my questions to the panelists, I do want to tell all of you that behind me, there is a link, scaupdates.org. If you have questions that come up throughout the discussion tonight, and you want to submit them, which they might be selected perhaps at the end for the Q&A, then please go to this link and submit them. And try to put your name next to them, because it's nice to hear the names of people who ask questions. So let me start really with some questions for you, Professor Halbertal. As you wrote in your book, Maimonides is one of the figures that there's already been so much written about him, so many books, so much analysis. He's so well known. So what made you decide to write a book on Maimonides?
Because he is well known. No. You know, first of all, anybody who writes a book on Rambam stands on top of shoulders of giants, right? Because so many great people wrote. What I was looking for an integrative book that will integrate three aspects. Life. Rambam had a very complex life as a person. You know, he was a refugee from Andalus. You know, complex life, halakha, and philosophy. And I thought it will be worthwhile to engage in that integrative, serious presentation of the Rambam. That's what drove me, you know, clearly being at the feet of other scholars and learning from them. And I imagine that in 30, 50 years, or even maybe in 5 years, there will be a better book.
Well, we'll get back here together again and talk about it. But let me ask you, you write about his biography, about his works, and you mentioned that Maimonides tried to bring about 2 intellectual revolutions to really change the Jewish world at his time. So can you describe those 2 intellectual revolutions that he was aiming for?
Let's start with philosophically. His version is the sort of Yahadut he wanted to promote, and in ways that were new in terms of the way he formulated them. The first one is he redefines the problem of idolatry. We have to remember that. Usually we think idolatry is people going to the temples of the Baal, of the Asherah, and worshiping other gods. Maimonides thought that this is a problem, but there is a more severe problem is when the idol is in your mind, right? And he thought that the problem of idolatry in its essence is internalized, right? If someone has an anthropomorphic picture of God, and he worships an alien God. Basically, he worships himself, right? So that was the first thing. By the way, that had a lot of implication in terms of the way he understood religious language and other issues. But the one thing is, Maimonides, as the one who struggles against Avodah Zarah, he redefined the problem and had large impact on all of us in the way he thought about the problem. The second is that Rambam thought, usually many people think that God and the religious drama begins when there is a natural order, has an inertia, and then there is a miracle, and you know that God exists, or you encounter God when the natural order is broken. Ness is the carrier of the religious attitude. Now, for Rambam, the main manifestation of God is in order itself, what he called wisdom. And that has, again, a far-reaching implications, right? The Rambam says, you know why Moshe split the sea? Because they had to cross it. It's not religiously significant. It's the order. It's the teva. You want to know where God is manifested. It's in the wisdom and vastness and greatest of the natural order. The third thing, and I'll be short, the third thing is the Rambam thought that the distinction between what's internal to the tradition and what's external tradition is not as valid, because he thought that science and metaphysics, the study of philosophy and science, is not Torah umada, that the Torah person has to know science. Wasn't his version. But that the science has a religious role. That Ahavat Hashem and Yirat Hashem, the ultimate religious experiences and attitude, is achieved through this medium. And in that respect, he broke the barrier between what's inside. So you take all those three things, al regel achat, this is theologically or religiously, I would say, the main sensibilities of the Maimonidean transformation. The second thing, that's a completely different dimension, but related, is really the Mishneh Torah. The first all-comprehensive code of halacha, which nobody did before, that stands at a towering achievement for generations, right? By the way, it's also an achievement in the Hebrew language. It's a cholesterol-free Hebrew, right? Leshono HaZahav, they used to say, right? And describe him, Leshono HaZahav. So these two, now I would say for other people, each of these separately is a life achievement.
Wow.
Right? And Maimonides did it all, and also combine it in one systematic perspective.
Thank you. So really to start the conversation, I want to try to tease out some disagreement, if it's okay, between everyone sitting here. So I want to turn to the two of you rabbis, because I'm assuming that you've learned about Rambam not in the halls of academia, but inside the rabbinic Bet Midrash. And I want to ask you, each of you, to comment. Are there any areas in which you find that you understand Maimonides, his life and his works, differently than Professor Halbertal? So Rabbi Sutton, we can perhaps start with you.
So I might disappoint you a little bit.
Okay.
I may not get as controversial as you want, but what I'll do for a minute is use that opportunity, first of all, to commend Professor Halbertal on an amazing work on Harambam, and actually to take a look at the approach sometimes, not necessarily specific of Professor Halbertal in this book, but sometimes of what I'll call academia in general, and maybe you'll get your spicy answer. The point being, which I think very often is a misreading of Harambam, and I think it starts back 200 years ago or 150 years ago, and it starts really with the writings of a Professor Strauss. Professor Strauss had an interesting approach. To him, the words of Harambam, and he based himself on a certain introduction to the More Nevuchim, and where he writes about different reasons why authors contradict themselves and how he would at that point contradict himself. And very often, sometimes we see contradictions in Maimonides' writing. And the question then becomes, how do we deal with this type of an attitude? How do we deal with it? And so some authors took the approach that Harambam wrote different things for different audiences. And when you take that approach, that there are different things for different audiences, so Harambam didn't necessarily mean everything he wrote. And when you start down that road, that Harambam didn't really mean everything he wrote, that he wrote certain things for specific audiences, it opens an interesting Pandora's box. And literally, people have written on countless works of Maimonides, including the 13 Ikarim, including the Yud Gimel Ikarim, that Harambam, because he either neglected it in one place or didn't write it somewhere else, or only wrote it in one component here in the Perush Mishnah, then he didn't really mean it. So much to the point that there might be some who write that Harambam, his own ma'amar on Tahiyat HaMetim, literally his own treatise to defend himself in the face of those who accused him of not believing in bodily resurrection, he didn't mean it. And they then reinterpret his words that he didn't believe in bodily resurrection. When that happens in some cases in the world of academia, we turn the approach of Harambam into an approach where we never know what's happening. Rather, the approach, I think, which is a legitimate academic as well as one that should permeate the Bet Midrash, is an approach to the best of our ability to study Harambam's works in their entirety, his halachic works, his philosophical works, his commentaries, as much as we can, and analyze and look at contradictions as best as we can and try and resolve them. For example, the professor mentioned just now something about the passage through Yam Suf, because it was a necessary function, not a miracle. However, when you open his Perush Mishnah to Pirkei Avot, you find a very different function. Over there, he takes the Midrash literally, and in fact, they went in a semicircle, and it was a miracle to be a miracle. So we need to look at these sources and texts, and not say schizophrenic Rambam wrote for one audience one way and for another audience another, but rather we need to analyze as best as we can, and sometimes the answers don't come easily. Sometimes we may not get there, but we still have an obligation to Maimonides to take every word he wrote seriously.
Just may I
Go ahead.
It's just by way of explaining what I said about Kriyat Yam Suf. I didn't say that the Rambam didn't say that there was a miracle there. There was a miracle, sure. He says it. It's a miraculous event. But he says, "Ama'amin al pi otot yesh belibo dofi." You cannot base your religion on miracle, right? There was a miracle. They needed a miracle. They didn't have a fleet of boats there, right? So, נצטרכו למן, נצטרכו ללחם, ירד המן. It was a miracle. The point is different religiously. I mean, we have to understand. The grounding of religious life is in order itself, in the wisdom in nature, right? Because because everybody can come with his counter miracles, you know. I remember my father, Alav Shalom, comes from a Hasidic family, and he says the two Admorim two Hasidim were fighting which Admor is greater. So one Hasid said, "My Admor is greater." Why? Once we went to collect money from a big Gvir for tzedakah, and the Gvir said, "I don't want you there." Slammed the door. The Admor was so upset, and he said, "Let the house fall on this family." And the Shamash said, "But there are children there." And the Admor said, "So it shouldn't fall." And you know, it didn't fall. Now, what I want to say is the following. Rambam is not a denier of miracle, chas v'shalom, but he thinks that religious life is based on the structure of causality, and this is why the study of nature has a religious meaning. That's where you see God's greatness and wisdom. That's the point I wanted to make.
Right, so what I was addressing, and I'll just answer back in one question, is that I agree with that.
I agree with what you said.
The Rambam absolutely had miracles out of a necessity, a structure. The religion is not to be based on miracle. Religion is based to be learning and order. However, the peculiarity of what he writes in the Perush Mishnayot makes that miracle an unnecessary miracle, because he takes the Midrash literally that they came out at the exact same point where they exited where they entered. And that's a enigma a little bit to what he said. I'm just trying to point out the complexity of Harambam's approach, that at times he makes or writes statements in different works that are enigmatic to his larger approach. That's all I was pointing, not denying that.
Yeah, and now we have a great Dvar Torah to share at the Seder table about Yam Suf and the Yam Suf and the nature of miracles and faith. But Rabbi Dweck, coming back to you, is there any area in which you find some difference in your understanding of Rambam and
well, first of all,
go ahead.
I do want to thank everybody for coming tonight. It's very good to see you. And I want to thank Louis Jerome and the people who arranged this, Amy Bailey and everyone. It's an honor to be able to share this night with everyone and to think and speak about the greatest influence of my life. I don't disagree with Professor Halbertal's presentation of Harambam as he did. As a matter of fact, I said to him and I said to many people here that in my readings of books on the Rambam, of which I've read quite a few, it's the greatest book that I've ever read on the Rambam. And I think that it is most faithful to Harambam's study and his thinking. There's only, if I were to say one thing, it would be this. Only not to argue, but to extend it a touch. When the professor says that Harambam bases religious connection, life, and so on order, on nature, and there I see the wisdom of God, it's because Harambam saw the entirety of creation as an expression of God. In other words, the only way for me to get to know the unknowable God is through his expressions. And the entire world, all of it, its entirety, is an expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the more that I get to know what it is that he created, the more I know him. Yeah. And that's the source of the religious thing. And because people will think that, you've taken miracles away from us. Miracles are fun. Miracles are exciting. They're invigorating. We want to be able to see God's wonders in it. And, everything else is kind of mundane. But when I realized that, I'm going to say, if you don't mind to silence the phones, because it's been like, a few all of them.
But silencing the phone is a miracle now.
It's amazing. Yeah. But we don't believe based on miracles. So, the idea that I can genuinely interact with God through the world that He created is to me, the most invigorating and most enthralling idea. So that's the only extension that I would make.
Thank you. Well, since I couldn't get so much controversy at the beginning, let me ask a different question. I tried. I'm going to keep trying. Okay.
We like each other.
I know. I'm making my job difficult. Yeah. But you know what? Let me ask you then about the controversies in which Maimonides himself was involved in, because he was engaged in so many different arguments, and for many people in his time, he was deeply controversial. Right. So I wanted to start with you, Professor. Can you speak a little bit about the main complaints or arguments that the detractors of Maimonides had against him, and discuss a little bit how Maimonides himself reacted to them?
Right. So there are two main realms. The first is Mishneh Torah, just as a halachic work, a code. And there are other rabbinic authorities that say, let's take, for example, the hairs of the Geonim that are in Baghdad, right? They are, to say the least, ambivalent, right? Because, by the way, in the introduction to Mishneh Torah, Harambam says that the Geonim have no global authority. They don't produce halakha. They produce ad hoc decisions for the community. And there was, I would say, a rejection of the project of creating a unified halakha backed by the authority of Rambam, coming from different scholars in different places, right? Take the Ravad, Rabbi Avraham ben David, a great scholar, a giant. While Maimonides is alive, right? They're the same age. The first hasaga, the first comment of Ravad on Mishneh Torah says, "Ze hamechaber savar letaken velo tiken." This compiler, this author, thought that he's repairing something, but he's not repairing. Why? Because if he would have told us the source of his ruling, we might have been convinced, but now that we don't have the source, so we are in a... So there was a shock created by the fact of the code. That's a kind of a whole front that opened by Maimonides' project. Then there were criticism of his religious theological attitudes. For example, one thing that was at the front, we have to remember in Provence, 1232, in the polemics against Rambam, Sefer HaMadda was banished. Moreh Nevuchim was banished. For example, Maimonides calling a person who's a magshim, who has a corporeal conception of God, a heretic, a mean, that doesn't have a place in the world to come, was an affront to other views of Judaism. So there was a halachic front and there was a theological front. This has a very complex, important history. How Maimonides dealt with it is Maimonides, Maimonides has many sides to him, right? On the one hand, he is polemic. Wow. I mean, when he thinks something is idolatry, you better not to be next to him, right? He can be very sharp. And yet he has a touch. I'm going to talk about just one vignette to understand Rambam as a person. Rambam had many students. He had also groupies. What's the definition of a groupie? A groupie is someone who admires the master, but he has no idea what the master says. So he had, in Baghdad, he had a fellow, I think his name is Abu Bakr, who Rambam writes to him. You know, he says, I don't know Hebrew, I don't know anything. Rambam says, Torah b'chol lashon, one halacha at a time. But here's the problem. This guy nominated himself as the Rambam's ambassador in Baghdad. The last thing Rambam wants is that this guy will be his representative. And he fights and he cross. So the question is how to remove him from that role without hurting him as a person, because he's so loyal. Rambam writes to him the following, and that actually shows you his relationship to the polemics. He says, look, these people who argue against me, they become big by arguing against me, right? He said, so emnenim, they get reward. I don't mind it. And we have a rule in the Talmud, ze ne'enev ze lo chaser. When someone is rewarded and you're not damaged, it's a midat zdom to stop it. So he said, you know, he removes it. So Maimonides was fierce in his positions and very understanding of the social realities and the human conflicts that will be produced, and having deep faith. And I think it's he has a very beautiful letter to his close students. He said, having a deep faith that at the end, all the personal quarrels, all questions of authority, the power of thought and truth and the excellence of the work will transcend everything. I think that's the combination of both where the fronts were and how the Rambam responded to them.
Thank you. And since, Professor, you started talking about groupies and making this feel really relevant to today, I wanted to actually direct the question to Rabbi Sutton to speak a little bit about controversy in today's rabbinic world, right? Are there any, sorry.
I can't imagine what
I
you're
get to choose the
about.
questions, so, right, there's nothing there. No, but you know.
Rabbi Dweck answer that question?
No. No, but really, do you see any similarities or differences between the dynamics of the disagreements today with those that were at the time of Maimonides? And what do you think today's rabbis and community leaders can learn from those earlier controversies about how to, you know, deal with them today?
So let's back up for a minute.
Sure.
In reality, the idea of controversy, as the professor pointed out, was directed at to Harambam from multiple points. I like to make a little bit of a different distinction, but it goes on the same lines as the professor. Harambam had what we'll call the local controversies, the controversies that ranged from the Geonim et Bavel and the initial controversies, which at least in Harambam's mindset, at least the way Harambam understood it, it was because he believed that his work was actually removing a certain monopoly that a certain group of leadership felt they had and were entitled to on the development of halakha. The approach of the Mishneh Torah was sort of a democratizing halakha and presents the law in its clarity to all people. And therefore, this would, or was at least perceived as a limitation or a, let's say...
It unseated them.
What?
It unseated them.
Right, it sort of unseated their monopoly, and it enabled people to read and study and learn. That's a very, very sensitive thing. Because if we take a perspective for a minute, and we believe that the Geonim at the time were not just interested in their own seat and authority, but believed for a moment that their authority was crucial to ensuring that the halakha would be properly observed and not misread or misunderstood. That controversy is ancient as well as modern. The idea of the empowerment of how much the rabbi empowers the people, presents them the laws, and how much the rabbi insists on a, what's the good word, and a dependency, but more of a dependency of almost an obedience, almost a slavish obedience to rabbinic authority. That tension, right, comes back from the time of the Geonim with Harambam, and I think it presents itself in different manifestations in our rabbinic world today. So, yes, there is a paradigm. In addition, Harambam was dealt also questions about his own philosophy and his own understanding of tradition. And Harambam, of course, presented us with novel approaches. Harambam, but he was at the same time extremely, extremely traditional. Harambam, for example, rejects an approach which even the Geonim present, that Agadot in the Talmud may not be authoritative, right? There are many Geonim that wrote that, and Harambam believed harshly and very strongly and firmly in a total obedience to the words of Hazal in their entirety. And at the same time, he presents a model that actually incorporates philosophical and scientific advancements within his Torah view and world. And he was willing to reinterpret texts. That idea, that tension of tradition and modernity, and that in their approach, as well becomes a source of tension even in today's world in the approach to how to read texts and how much can we be liberal in our reading of texts and in novel interpretations. So a lot of those ancient arguments do present themselves in modern texts.
Thank you.
There's one thing that I think is important to say very briefly, if I may, about the rabbinic controversies that Harambam experienced. And that is, we have access to his letters, which is, I think, essential. I mean, anybody who wants to really understand Harambam, of course, you read the Mishneh Torah, you read the Moreh Nebuchim, you have an aspect of Harambam. But we are very fortunate to have his letters. We have a huge amount of his personal letters. And, he had this student to whom he wrote the Moreh Nebuchim, who is writing to his Rav, hearing the disparaging comments made by other rabbis about his Rav, about the Rambam, hearing how people are slighting him, insulting his work, and so on and so forth. And he writes in such anger back to Harambam. And Harambam writes back to him. He says, if you're my Talmid, then don't just learn from my halachot, learn from my actions. And what he said to his Talmid was, in one place he says, God's book gets all of this controversy. I should be better. This is what it is, but don't waste your midot, your attributes, your humanity on fighting for me when I myself wouldn't fight. Because he didn't see the value in getting into these controversies. He genuinely saw it as primal drives that people were having to deal with that he wasn't going to have anything to do with. And I have to say, I had very, very minor, rabbinic interactions like this. But nonetheless, it was something that, for me, was a tremendous strength. And I think that it's something that all of us, if we're looking tonight to begin to be students of Harambam, this is what he says. If you want to be my student, then think about the way that you act. And that if you're going to be a Chacham, then it must be mina ne'elavim ve'enam olvim. You hear your disgrace, you do not respond. Because at the end of the day, you believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs through all things, that you're not going to get into the mud and get yourself dirty, and that you remain holding. I think that regardless of what generation we live in, is one of the greatest lessons that we get from Harambam.
Thank you. And let me ask a follow-up to this, because you mentioned midot, what it means for someone to behave in an ideal and proper way. And you know, Maimonides, besides for writing esoteric, metaphysical, intellectual things, he also wrote about what it means to live a good life. So Rabbi Dweck, can you elaborate for those of us today in 2019 who are looking to our Rambam and asking ourselves, how can we learn from him what it means to be good people, good of the Hashem, good servants of God? What would your answer be?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's central in Harambam's Torah, that idea. I mean, the first thing that a person needs to question is, how did Harambam define good? You know, talk about leading a good life. What was good? And it's literally one of the first things that he discusses in the Moreh Nebuchim. It's the second chapter. He talks about this concept of Tov and Ra. And without getting into too much detail because of time, Harambam essentially says that our concept of morality, essentially what we mean to be good, must be tethered to what we deem and recognize as being true. In other words, what we look to be good should be what is true and real in this world. What is viable if we're embedding it in time, and what is ultimately going to be real. The reason for that ultimately is because he saw the ultimate truth as being God. Whereas Harambam calls God the Matsui Rishon. He is the first existence. And that means that he is the only ultimately real existence. And what we mean by true is that which exists. So if my connection to God essentially is what brings me life and nourishment and strength and refinement and so on and so forth, that is what good should mean for us. So he speaks in the Mishneh Torah about a mitzvah in Devarim, Kafhet, which tells us, V'halachta b'drachav, you are to walk in God's ways. And he says, what is God's ways? And he uses this language. He says, Hadrachim hatovim v'haisharim. They are the ways that are good and straight. And essentially, the ways that are good and straight are ways that are viable and true. And they are ways, ultimately, because of that, that connect you to God. And so throughout the entirety of Hilchot Derot, in which he elaborates on that mitzvah, he speaks about what does it mean to live in the way that God lives. I mean, how do you do that as a human being? We're as far away from God as one could imagine. But ultimately, if you are living in a way that is viable not only for you, but for the world around you and your interactions, that you genuinely do all that you can in order to be able to genuinely think about how my actions are going to make me a better, stronger, more viable person and those interactions that I'm involved with, that's connecting to God. You know, so in that, he sees the mitzvah of the Torah, walking in the ways of God. What is a good life? To genuinely spend time on that. What does that mean for us practically? It means, first of all, that we actually have to be brave enough to examine our own lives. That's part of it, is to be able to genuinely examine our lives and question regularly how I am responding, how I'm speaking, how I'm acting, how I'm thinking. Because even internally, my thought ends up translating into action. And if I'm really interested in doing that, I ask other people. Because I realize that my mind is a loop. And so I want to hear outside information. I want to study. I want to read Harambam. He sat there, quill and ink. I mean, we forget that he wasn't using a computer, right? I mean, literally, the man, quill and ink with a candle, is writing out for us here, these are ways that you can actually better your life and connect to God and become more refined and robust. So, you know, and these things are things that we hear about all over the place today. How do you better your life? How do you live a more refined life? Harambam says that in itself is service of God. That is the greatest mitzvah. It's walking in God's way, to be able to sit with a therapist, if it's a good therapist. If it's not a good therapist, don't waste your time. But if it's a good therapist, you sit with a therapist. You say, listen, this is what I'm having trouble with. Can you help me? And if you're sitting with a therapist and the therapist just keeps you coming back and you're not really getting better and you're not doing the work, change it around. But it's a mitzvah to do it, right? That's what it means to live a good life.
Professor Halbertal, I want to ask you a question that I think has already begun to come up a little bit. Many people speak about Maimonides as representing a tolerant, open-minded Judaism, specifically because of his openness to non-Jewish sources of wisdom. But at the same time, many of his writings and his halachot also depict a certain social conservatism, and like really trying to be very strict in terms of authority. So can you speak a little bit about what might seem like a paradox of both incredible tolerance, but also being a conservative at the same time?
Yes, so you're right. He was, and then we'll talk more about the other aspects of Yashar and Atov, etc., but we'll come to that. He was definitely open-minded in the sense that, as I tried to articulate at the beginning, he didn't see a difference. He didn't see a wall between philosophy and Torah. For him, it was a means for achieving the highest religious status. So there was definitely an openness in that respect. But I think he had a sense of social forces, the Hamon, the masses, that need to be controlled. And if you ask, what are the masses for Maimonides? What does it mean, the Hamon? By the way, that's a relevant category today to a certain degree, is those who are completely controlled by the imagination. By that I mean, for them everything is possible. They don't have a sense of causal order. And therefore they're vulnerable to promises and threats, right? If you come to someone who doesn't know anything about the world, and you tell him, if you don't pass your child to the Molech, you're not going to have fruit next year, there will be a drought, he will do it. Because he's controlled by anxiety and fear. So he understood, he had a very, in some ways, dark view or cautious view of the uncontrolled power of groups and masses, especially when they are controlled by the imagination. You know, in my country, in Israel, right, we are in election campaign now. Yeah. That's where you see the force of the imagination. You say enough time, shalom, bitachon, etc. As long as you threat and promise, people will go after you. I'm not taking sides, right? I'm just describing all sides. So, and that was a source of he was a social conservative in deep ways, very deep, coming from that view, and a radical open-minded when they come to issues of truth. And that's a combination, a complex combination, both in halacha and thought, right? Yeah. That, I think that would describe him.
Yeah, thank you. And perhaps speaking about some of those areas in which he was more of a social conservative, I want to ask Rabbi Sutton, so far we've spoken of Maimonides' ideas in ways that everyone, or at least we agree with and look up to him. But sometimes there are things that Maimonides has written that some people today, young people, might struggle with. I've heard from a lot of individuals, specifically questions about the way Rambam speaks about women and their situation as mostly being inside the home and being subservient to the men in their lives. So what would be your advice to individuals today who are reading certain things that they're challenged by and perhaps misaligned with what Maimonides is writing?
So I think we really need to have a little bit of historical perspective here. As the professor mentioned, Rambam was very concerned with the ability, with the masses and the ability to manipulate masses. And he felt he was watching that in the religious world as well, and certainly in the quote-unquote idolatrous world, but even in, at times, Shmirat HaMitzvot, in the way that they're performed, became to him somewhat problematic. So to Harambam, the idea of the intellect and the intellectual and his observance was paramount, and that became the most important role. And those who he believed, rightfully or not, as intellectually inferior, and it seemed to be, and it could be social reasons or not, that he clearly in Hilchot Talmud Torah classified women on that role. That became for him something that needed to be tamed. That became for him, and it wasn't necessarily feminism, but that challenge to intellectualism became for him a serious danger to his beliefs and religion in general. That needed to be tamed. That needed to be curtailed. And therefore, sometimes his language could be harsh. But one has to remain in the, if the struggle is for today, one has to very often keep a historical perspective. People often ask me, why do you teach the Moreh Nevuchim in its entirety? Why do you read the beginning of Helek Bet? Why don't you skip it? It's outdated. Why are you doing it? And other tedious chapters. And I always say the same thing. Because even when Harambam was quote unquote wrong or outdated based on an Aristotelian view of some thing that today we understand in a different scientific manner, I need to see and master his methodology. I need to see not only what he said, but how he said it and what he dealt with and how we dealt with the challenges of his time. I then can take and I can be not a slavish Maimonidean, but a Maimonidean. I then can take his approach, I can look at his approach, I can internalize his approach, and use it in ways that he may never have imagined possible. I can now look at issues that come up in a 21st century scenario, and I can actually apply it. And that is the ultimate way that we take Harambam, and I believe that's how Harambam would have learned Harambam. That's how he would have read the idea of ever-changing lifestyles and historical situations and applying it in that. And Harambam was a complex person. As the professor mentioned, his intellectual openness to philosophy and the search for truth was unmatched. And nevertheless, there were even intellectual aspects of his time that he opposed. Harambam opposed almost all popular culture in his day. He opposed poetry, which was rampant through rabbinic and non-rabbinic sources. And he had a very harsh attitude towards the poets and the poetry of his time. He opposed the study of history. He opposed certain studies which he believed were dangerous to the intellectual advancement of his approach to Torah and mitzvot. That is where he reacted in a certain way.
Okay, thank you. And continuing with questions about, Maimonides and contemporary life, Rabbi Dweck, very often when I speak to people and they find out that I'm Sephardic, they'll immediately assume that I'm superstitious at the same time. And if you, I don't know if it happened to anybody else in this room, maybe with the people that I meet. But my question to you is the following. Maimonides was actually a Sephardic leader who spoke strongly against different types of superstitious behaviors. So what would you think Maimonides would say today to the widespread usage of different things like the red string or using different verses to try to heal people or being afraid of the Ain Hara, of the evil eye? What would you think, again, if we could guess a little bit about how Maimonides would understand what's going on today and what advice he would give our communities?
I think that he would give the same advice that he gave in his time. I mean, we think that we've changed over 800 years. We have not changed. We're just variations on a theme. I don't know about superstition being unique to Sfaradim, not Sfaradim. I know
As an
superstition.
Ashkenazi, I tell you it's not unique.
It's not unique. It's definitely not unique. I mean, superstition comes about. Harambam's concern with superstition was the Torah's concern with superstition. I mean, Torah speaks about it, and it simply says, Tamim tiyeh Adonai Elohecha. That in your relationship with God, be whole, be wholesome, be faithful. And the problem with superstition is that it's just not faithful. Because if our goal is to build a relationship with God and a mutual connection, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God is saying to us, I will watch over you, I am your God, you are my people, then my investment in life is meant to be investing in that relationship. So when I wear a red string, or when I do anything that I believe will cut corners, so to speak, right, will guard me from the chaos of the world, rather than investing in my relationship with the creator of that world, the ultimate force of that world, I'm essentially insulting God by doing that. And I'm saying, I don't know about, I get the whole relationship thing, it's too much for me, I'm going to do this that'll hopefully cut the corner. And that's really what lies at the base of all superstitions. I mean, if you think about it, any superstitious aspects that we engage in are based in fear. It's from a fear place, and we use superstitions to protect us from fear. And the thing is, we don't want to risk it. What does it hurt? What does it harm? And people have said that to me before. What does it harm? It doesn't hurt. It does hurt. It's actually tremendously damaging, and that's the way that Harambam spoke about it. He spoke about it as being tremendously damaging. He embeds all of his discussion on superstition in the laws of Avodah Zarah, of idol worship. Right? So it's essentially turning to something other than God to be able to help me through the difficulties and chaos of the world. And what we know is that before we even talk about a relationship with God, we know that in our lives, relationships are not easy. I mean, if we're really going to invest in a relationship, any relationship, it requires consistency, care, attention, thought, awareness, empathy. And all of that is required in our relationship with God, no less, if not more. So that's what Harambam would say. Harambam would say, okay, you wear the red string. Besides the fact that it's prohibited in Torah to do so, it is a slight and a direct affront to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's why it is very bad. It is a problem to do it, and it's not true that it's not harmful.
Okay, thank you. Professor, I think you wanted to comment earlier about the question regarding a Tov Ve'Yashar, what it means to live a good life according to Maimonides.
Actually,
or you can comment on...
No, that relates to everything.
Yeah.
I want to say one thing that I find very powerful formulation in Rambam, which I thought a lot about it. In the end of Sefer HaMadai, in the end of Ilchut Tshuva, Law of Repentance, the Rambam says, Al pi ha'de'ah, al pi ha'ava, right? He says, according to knowledge, love. The more you know, the more you love. It's a powerful sentence. And I want to say something about that and the spiritual, religious meaning as it relates to the questions of what does it mean according to knowledge, love? I think that ultimately, Rambam thought that the main challenge of us as humans is to shift from fear to love. That's the ultimate achievement. Mi'irah le'ava. Now, what is irah? What is relationship of irah? Irah is instrumentalizing, right? We come to the world with a grip. We're gripped by fear and desire, right? That's our deep side. And we see the world as just one instrument, either threatening or a source of pleasure, right? And we tend to instrumentalize the world. And love is a non-instrumental relationship. Oseh mitzvah, oseh emet mipnei shu emet, not because it will give me something. So if you love someone, that's when friends realize that the other friend is using them, and we're not there to give them, they're left. Friendship is betrayed. So love is a non-instrumental relationship, right? Now, how do we shift? That's a big problem in our life. As religious people, as human beings, how do we shift from fear to love? And the Rambam thinks it's through knowledge. Through knowledge. I want to explain that. And I want to give a parable from relationship between children and their parents. You know, as a father, you sometimes wonder, do my kids love me or I'm just an instrument, just a credit card, right? Now, how do you know?
This one we need the therapist, by the way, the really good one. Yeah.
How do you know that a love emerged? When the child begins to know you outside of you being a tool for him. He realized that the parent has a life, has et cetera, et cetera. The same thing with us and the world. When we know the world, right? When we know the world and God, we know that there is a world which is not either there for us or against us. It's not one big tool. That's what causality teaches you, right? When you know the causal structure of the world, you get freed, right, from the relationship of fear and desire, right? So to love God is to not instrumentalize God. To love the world is not to instrumentalize the world, and it's done through knowledge. And I want to come to the issue of superstition because it's all related. You know, the Rambam is very, I always ask myself, the Rambam has a very controlled language, but sometimes in the Mishneh Torah, he gets upset, right? He you know, and many times it relates to instrumentalizing Torah, right? For example, in Ilchot Mezuzah, he says, right, ואלה שכותבים שמות, those who write, etc., לא די שפסלו המזוזה, right, etc., etc., אלא עשו אהבת השם כאילו הוא כמע להניית עצמם. They did love of God as if what's written in מזוזה, ואהבת את השם אלוהיך, as if it's an amulet for their own needs, right? And the Rambam understood that since Torah is there to take you out to instrumentalizing mode, it can itself become one big instrument, right? And by the way, you see it another thing. When the Rambam says something apropos polemics, the Rambam did not allow people to earn from Talmud Torah, right? And he says, you know, כל הלומד תורה ומתפרנס מן הצדקה, כי בא מאור הדעת, דבר השם בזה. There's a lot of artillery there, which means people don't listen, right? There, again, you're instrumentalizing Torah. So I think this is a deep passion that relates to using religious sacred objects as vehicles for bodily reward or defending of fear. While all the idea of this way of life is the capacity to transcend the grip of fear and desire into love. If you ask me, what's the main role of philosophy, main role of science, it is the role of Torah in the deepest sense, is that transformation from fear to love. This is the meaning of לפי הדעה, על פי הדעה, לפי האהבה, right? And it's, I think that's very powerful. It's at the core of Maimonides' understanding of the human predicament, and also the core of the, and this is why he becomes so, Rabbi Dweck, you said exactly, that's a kind of a challenge to Avodat Hashem. This is where it becomes a source of deep polemics, because he sees that the power of instrumentalizing takes over the medium that was supposed to help you overcome instrumentalizing, which is Torah itself, right? And that's where we have a serious challenge.
I think it's important, I know time and so on, but I do think it's important to point one thing out. That I will also, I'm going to extend a bit what Dr. Halbertal is saying. Rambam did not believe that when you understand the world, that will ultimately bring you to the love of God. It's important to know the Hebrew here. The word da'at is not just knowledge. The word da'at is connection. It's connectivity through knowledge. It's interaction through knowledge. And Rambam speaks a great deal in the Moreh Nebuchim about randomness. He says the world is a random place. Even with God and the way that God runs the world, there are moments, there are aspects of randomness. And the only way ultimately to be able to find a path, connection, and place within that randomness is through Da'at Hashem. It's through knowing God in the sense that not just that I am intellectually aware, but that I'm plugged in, that I am connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through knowing Him, through His world, through His Torah, and so on and so forth. But Rambam recognized that without that, we fall into a sea of undetermined, unknowns. And that's an important aspect to it, that it's a relationship-oriented idea, not simply an intellectually oriented idea.
Before we take some questions from the audience.
I just want to comment a little bit.
Of course, go ahead.
And it will probably turn around to superstition for a minute.
Great.
Because the idea, and it connects a little bit to the instrumentalism that the professor spoke about. It comes back, and Rambam is very, very engaged when it comes to, throughout his work and throughout his even understanding on Ta'amei Mitzvot, to the concept of Avodah Zarah. And the Avodah Zarah at its core is very much a response to that fear of the unknown, to a random world, to a situation, and that of their Avodah Zarah seeks control. His response to the fear is to somehow seek out a control. Now, in a polytheistic structure, that may seem to look at deity here or a certain way to attain out of that fear control and an escape out of the randomness of the world that presents him. The monotheist, the way Rambam understood him, is engaging, as we said, in a relationship. And that relationship, on many levels, is man's, in other words, man's engaging God on God's terms. The will of God, the ultimate, to engage God on God's terms and to understand the world in His terms. That becomes very difficult. What happens within the Torah when man engages God not on His terms, in a sense, becomes a form of Jewish idolatry. When man seeks, for example, a superstition, he again seeks control. When man, and for example, when man engages, and the interpretation, if one sees we just read the Parashat Shemini, that when Nadav and Avihu seek to engage God in a way asher lo tziva Hashem, when the Jewish people seek to engage God through the Bamot, that becomes tantamount to an idolatrous relationship, because that relationship is outside the realm of engaging God through His Torah.
Thank you. So before we take some questions for the audience, I did want to ask if you could each say shortly, what would be like, besides for everything we've discussed, for individuals today seeking to take one thing with them that they can apply in their life from Maimonides' wisdom to become better people, better Jews. If you could each just share one thing, one piece of advice for all of us here before we turn to the questions, that would be great. Do you want me to start with you or let you? Please. All right, Rabbi Dweck. Okay.
I mean, there are so many things, but I think one thing that we haven't touched on, and so I'll mention that. is that Harambam genuinely believed passionately that the Torah belonged to the Jewish people and that every Jewish person could study Torah, even women. You know, we were talking about that. Harambam believed, although there might not be a mitzvah of Talmud Torah, specifically, as far as Harambam was concerned, in order to be able to know God, it includes studying Torah, and he included women in that. He believed that every single Jew could know Torah, and he dedicated his life to teaching it. So he wrote the Mishneh Torah. And he wrote the Mishneh Torah to make Torah in its entirety accessible to everyone. And so if I were to say to you, what could you take? It's that. I mean, we live in a time now where the Mishneh Torah is translated. It's accessible online thanks to Chabad. There's, it is at your fingertips. You have access to it on your phone. You have time. You literally could spend every single day studying one halakha a day, 2 halachot a day. And in 3, 4, 5 years' time, you end up covering a tremendous amount of information. But what happens is that Torah becomes yours. That's what Harambam believed. He believed that it belonged to you, and he believed that Torah should be studied in its entirety, and he made that accessible. And it's still accessible. So that's one thing that I think that people don't always put out with regards to Harambam. They say many, many, many things. But to him, the most major thing was to be able to have full knowledge of Torah. And he wanted to empower that knowledge. And so I would encourage everyone to take advantage of that. I will say one thing only because I know that it's happening over here. You know, Harambam, and Professor Halbertal points this out in his book, Harambam, coming from the school of Sfarad, of Spain, you know, he never stopped calling himself a Spaniard. Through his entire life, he called himself the Sfaradi, because he believed that the Torah study in Spain was the greatest that there was in the world at the time. And he learned in that school that the Mishnah, which also presents Torah, essentially the oral Torah in its entirety, that the Mishnah can be studied on its own, as a work. It doesn't have to be studied only as an opening to the discussions of the Talmud, of the Gemara. And so he wrote a commentary on the Mishnah. And I know that the community is beginning a Mishnah study shortly. And I think that, they're doing it, Jesse Salem is heading it. They're doing it with the Pirush of Harambam, with the commentary of Harambam. So the rabbis of the community are each taking part in teaching another Masechet. He's got me doing the introduction, which I'm delayed on, but the first few classes are up, and they will be up on their entirety. But that's what I would suggest. The Torah belongs to you. It is your inheritance. It's yours. Take it. And Harambam has made it accessible.
Thank you.
It's a little difficult and almost paradoxically antithetical to Harambam to focus on one thing, because, but I'll try and do that anyway. Because as the rabbi pointed out, he looked at Torah as a absolutely whole model. But I think one thing which Harambam consistently says so many times, and I want to quote a word of his son, Rabbeinu Abraham ben Harambam, and he said that the mind and the sechel is a gift to give it to man prior to the Torah. And that's an amazing statement. And basically, what I think he means, and I think what Harambam advances himself to say, is that we owe the Torah our diligence. We owe God our diligence in understanding Torah. And we have to use every fiber in our brain to question, analyze, and seek to make sense of the Torah in its most pristine form. If man stops that process, if man stops to think and doesn't engage the Torah with every bit of intellect that he has, he does a disservice to learning, and he does a disservice to Torah. So Harambam at times veered away outside of the Torah's cases of the extension of the miraculous to everything, because that shuts man's thought process. Harambam attacked a group of philosophers as Kalam who refused to believe in an order to the universe because that enabled man to accept anything and to stop thinking. Man owes it to engage his intellect into every aspect. One person once, when he tried to legitimize not studying Harambam, once told me, listen, Harambam wrote this book for the Nibuchim. I want to tell you, I'm not confused. So I want to understand, we just need to understand how Harambam defined a navuch.
Which is very perplexed.
Right.
Yeah.
So the idea is, it is a man who has engaged Torah, who has mastered Torah. He has as well mastered the sciences of the world, the philosophical studies, and is now seeking to use, and is now questioning how these two studies can sometimes merge and and get together, how we can engage them both. And that is the Navoch who Harambam is addressing to help him through that process. That is not a secondary citizen. That is the ultimate height and level of study and of learning Torah.
Well, there's so many things said. I would just follow. I think in two sentences is this is a radical message of Rambam. It was very controversial. Is that a religious life that demands the sacrifice of thought is a betrayal of the very meaning of religious life, right? Because religious life is about making us fully human flourishing, which is our capacity to attain truth. That's what makes us human. And that's a powerful thing. I mean, that out there in science, in philosophy, is not a threat to faith. It's actually a way to expand, deepen, and anchor faith. And that's a powerful position that, Baruch Hashem, we had such a great giant to articulate it for us. Thank you.
And Baruch Hashem, we had you to help articulate the views of the great giants. But we're going to conclude in some minutes, but beforehand, I'm going to read a couple of questions that were submitted by the audience. Each of you feel free to choose whichever question you want to address and include within it whatever concluding words you might have. I know it's a lot of things. But I'll share a couple of them. One was submitted by Ali Sutton, who asked, Rabbi Dweck and Rabbi Sutton, where do you disagree with the Rambam? I didn't bring the controversy. It came from the audience.
You start.
Okay, no, wait. Let me share a couple more questions. I just answered the question. Yeah, let me.
Nothing.
Nothing.
No, I mean, go ahead.
Well, actually, Rabbi, let me just say a couple more, and then you will each choose whichever one you want to address. One, there were a lot of questions. Thank you, everybody, so much. I'm just choosing a couple. The rest, you can afterwards stay around or something. So A.B. Hidari asked, do you think Maimonides wrote the Mishneh Torah with the hope and expectation it would still be used as a primary code of halacha in 2019? Would he be happy knowing how it's being studied in Batei Midrash around the world today? And then the last question, this is by Ali Rishti. How do you think Maimonides would respond to the potential conflict between ideas in modern science versus the fundamental Jewish belief of the soul that transcends physical life? So those were three very big and different questions. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to just choose which one to address and just give some...
Could you repeat the last one?
Yes, the last one was, yes. How do you think Maimonides would respond to the potential conflict between ideas in modern science versus the fundamental Jewish belief of the soul that transcends physical life. And feel free to choose 1, 2, 3, or just any concluding remarks. So we'll end with this. Who wants to go first?
I'll start with the last one, because I imagine that, I imagine that the idea behind the last one is, the things that we know about science, that we know how things work today. We understand that, how it is that we're made. And all of the mystery that used to, that revolve around the human consciousness and so on and so forth, not that it's not still part of mystery, should kind of shut down this concept of the soul, of the transcendent aspect of humanity. Again, it's speculative because I can't answer for Harambam. All I can do is speak in terms of my own study of Harambam. But we definitely see where Harambam talks about emergent realities, meaning that Harambam definitely recognizes that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that that's part of the nature of the world. And so in science, we kind of break things down to know how they're made, whereas the question of meaning is one in where we put them together to be able to know why they are, what they're about, what meaning do they have. And I don't think that that changes with science. I think that Harambam was a scientist of his day, and he would say the same thing today. He would say, yes, we know that the neurons are firing, and that's where your thoughts come from, and the cells and the molecules, the atoms are all working, and that's where your body and the very substance of your being comes from, and yet the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. There's something more there that is beyond simply the constituent elements. And that is what we call soul. So the fact that we don't have pure definition for what soul is, that's fine. But the reality is that it's there, that consciousness is there, and that this is the way that we believe through Torah, that the manifestation of that consciousness, of that soul, ultimately manifests. So we can reduce things all we want, but the emergent aspects of reality are still very much there, and science doesn't explain those things.
I want to take his point and add one thing, and then I'll get back to one of the first two questions, is that I think we live at a time where it's the opposite the way most people think. I think we live in a time, if we were sitting as classical physicists, I might accept that question with a little bit of a more nervousness. But I think we're living at a time where not only does religion see the whole as much greater than the sum of its parts, but I think we're living in a time where science in itself understands the mystery in a much deeper way. And I think and I'm not saying that any quantum physicist will accept the soul and religion. I'm not coming to say that statement, but I'm certainly thinking that in a modern day today, the new theories and the ideas that some scientists are coming out actually open up a greater possibility to see and what we call the questioner called the transcendence of the soul. Now, I don't necessarily want to deal with what that means, because the idea of soul and what that means in the world of Harambam is something that we didn't explore, and
not for tonight.
Certainly not for tonight. But the idea of science actually coming around, in a certain sense, to some certain thoughts and processes of what we call Torah in its holistic view, is an amazing and a very exciting time for a student of Torah. Not as sometimes it's projected as a scary time. It becomes much more exciting, I think. And it's very interesting. And I think that's really what would we always say, what would Harambam have done? And I think the challenge is like you tell me what we disagree with Harambam. So I think the challenge is to be adult about it and to understand, as I mentioned earlier, that there are things that Harambam analyzed based on different perspectives of different positions, and he may have presented an outdated position. And it's an interesting idea. At the end of the 17th Perek of Ilchut Kiddush HaChodesh, he presents a Ptolemaic view of the universe. After this whole geocentric view of the universe. And then he says that he's not basing his source on Jewish sources, but rather on Greek sources. And then he says, but it's okay, because we know it to be true because the proofs are so strong. And so that's a very interesting statement because he does a few things at once. One, he enables us to look at what is said and not who is saying it, and at the very same time, we're going to do the same thing to him because he's sort of giving us the license to look at the idea, and if he based himself on an outdated theory, we could now rewrite those. So if we disagree with something he may have said, it's only because he has taught us how to think. He has taught us how to view the world. He has taught us how to view things outside of that box. He has enabled us to do that. We are truly his students, even as we disagree.
Thank you. Professor, the last words of the panel?
No, it's such a serious, deep questions. Just want to say one thing about science. And Rambam, he took science very seriously, but he always was concerned with limitations of human knowledge. You know, after all, we have just 1 kilo brain, something like that around. So let's take the problem of materialistic reduction. If I take a work of art, like a good Rembrandt piece, and I can give you all the chemical components of the work. I can give you all the laws of optics, the way it affects the retina and the way it is being translated through neuronic processes, etc., etc. I'll give you a full-fledged scientific account of all those components. I haven't yet told you why this painting makes such a big impression on you. So do we or should we have a fully reductive picture of the world via science? I think it's such a pretense that Maimonides will resist, by the way. It's interesting. Maimonides, for example, in his encounter with Aristotle, especially when it comes to the question of creation or eternity of the world, he says, look, here reason has come to its limits. So that awareness also has to be part of understanding of Rambam's thought. Now the question about the Mishneh Torah, that's very interesting. What would Maimonides think about the way the Mishneh Torah is studied? You know, once I'll finish with a funny line that I heard. He saw a contradiction in the Rambam, and he gave a terutz, he gave an answer, and they showed him that Maimonides himself was asked by Lunel that same contradiction, and he has another answer. So Reb Chaim looks and says, and this is an answer? So now, I think there is a way in which Maimonides will marvel of the fact that this work has managed to transcend so much of time. Here we are, right? Here we are in Manhattan talking about the Mishneh Torah. And yet, he will be like a composer very upset with the performance of his work, right? Very. Every wrong note will trouble him. So maybe it's better that he's not following all of his interpretations.
And with that, I want to thank all of you for not only an intellectually stimulating conversation, but also a really inspiring one. So thank you so much, all of you. And we now have SCA board member Maurice Levy conclude the evening.
Hey, everybody. I know we went a little bit over, so I'll make it quick. I'm Maurice Levy. I serve on the board of the SCA. I've been doing it proudly for about a year now, and as such, I'm here specifically for every one of you. As we wrap up the evening, I just want to again thank all of our panelists, Rabbi Sutton, Rabbi Dweck, and Professor Halbertal, for their thoughtful, thought-provoking answers to all the questions and the discussion we had, and our moderator, Dr. Bitton, for taking us through this journey. Thank you all again very, very much. It was beautiful. Special thank you one more time to the lead team that put this event together, Louis Jerome, Amy Bailey, Yvette Hittery, and Victor Dweck, for their hard work, which they continued literally around the clock. Thank you so much. And finally, I want to thank all of you on behalf of the SCA for coming and for contributing with all of your thoughtful questions. I hope that you all found some great takeaways from tonight's event, and I'm sure that we have plenty more to discuss going forward. One of the primary goals of the SCA, of the new SCA board, is to be engaged more closely in a dialogue with our community members and to create more programming that addresses your specific wants and needs. That's actually how tonight came to be. Louis Jerome read the book, this amazing book by Professor Halbertal, and then reached out to discuss it with us. He offered up great insights and very strong questions that he felt were echoed by many of our peers. That discussion was the start of the process that led to tonight's event. We at the SCA are looking forward to continuing to build around your requests. We'd love to hear from all of you. We want your questions, your thoughts, your concerns, and your feedback. We live in a time where we are overwhelmed by information, some of it in support of our heritage and traditions, while other information can be unsettling, creating a search for reconciliation and questions in need of answers. It's our commitment to bring forward more programming that builds discussion around these topics that are challenging and relevant and need to be discussed. I do hope that we can continue this conversation beyond tonight, and please be in touch with us in a multitude of ways with your questions and ideas for events or programs. If you want to just get involved and help make a difference, you can email us info@scaupdates.org, follow us on Instagram at SCA Updates, where you can message us, put comments on our posts, visit us in person. We'll continue to provide ongoing weekly classes for all ages on many different topics, with schedules available obviously on our multiple channels. And we're in the process of creating a brand new website that will be launching this summer, containing over 6,000 classes given by our rabbis and teachers, as well as access to many other community resources. So just please keep checking in. This is only the beginning. We really urge you, just continue to give us feedback. I think tonight was a wonderful success and a beautiful event, and really we want to continue to be able to address all the needs and wants of all of our constituents. So thank you again. Don't be shy. We'd love to hear from you because we are here for you. For anyone who'd like, we'll be praying our beat at the front of the auditorium after everybody clears out. Thank you again to everybody here.